Okay, I've just been unmuted. Okay, but I'm sort of back on again. Paul, I think you're muted at the moment. So while you're muted, I'll get the first question in. There've been a few people ask us about the motivation for writing the book. What was the main thing? You originally approached me, so could you go through that for us?
Yeah, I knew that there was a lot of this. This started in, as we said earlier, in scuba. I can't think how many years ago it was, but I knew that there was a lot of research on extensive reading. In fact, I didn't realize how much there was, but I knew there was a lot, but there turned out to be a very big lot. And it always seemed to me that there wasn't really a research-based analysis of that research. And the extensive reading, it seems to me, has always run a sort of a rough line between evangelicalism and a sort of hard-nosed research approach to the activity. And something that I really admired about the Extensive Reading Foundation conferences and symposiums was that it tended not to go the way of evangelicalism and, you know, you're a believer and you do it and things like that. It always seemed to me to be very strongly research-based, but I didn't know of any book or which had really dealt with the extensive reading research to try and evaluate it and to see what the message of that research was. So that was really my motivation for writing the book. I saw a sort of a need there, and most writing that I do, I largely write for myself because I want to get the ideas clear in my head. And so that was really my motivation for starting it off. And then, of course, with Rob knowing so much about extensive reading and with all his experience and helping set up extensive reading programs and things like that, I knew it'd be crazy to try and do it by myself and not to bring in Rob's expertise.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So,
but just to fire back at you,
I bought him breakfast and then he made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Thank you, yeah. But just to fire back at you, you and I had a chat sort of a week ago as sort of preparation for this, and I brought up the concept of maybe having an extensive listening book in a similar sort of thing, and I suggested it might be done by multiple authors, and you said no, do it yourself. So you know, it works the other way too. So I think that maybe by show of hands, whether you think an extensive listening book in a similar sort of vein to this one would be useful, feel free to raise your hands. And maybe that's something that I might do myself, or might get some co-authors to help out with in the future. Oh, we have quite a few hands up. Okay.
Yeah, I still hesitate. And the reason I hesitate is because I think that we're with extensive listening, I think we're probably a few months, maybe a year or two away from major breakthroughs in producing material for extensive listening. I don't know a lot about it, but I know that it seems to me that the major lack in extensive reading is the technology to edit spoken text in the way that written text is edited and produced for graded readers. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that with spoken language, you don't want to lose, you want at least 50% or more of extensive listening to be spontaneous, largely unprepared,
interactive,
unscripted sort of talk. But my understanding is that the technology where you can actually take such unscripted spoken talk and monologue and then edit it in the way that you edit graded readers to simplify it or to control the vocabulary, I think that's it. Some people say it's here already, the technology, but I think it's not quite here. I don't know enough about it, but that's why I think if I was getting involved in writing a book about extensive listening, I'd sort of be worried that by the time I'd written it, I'd be outdated by the technology.
Yeah, I mean, I can see where you're coming from that point of view. I don't think that would prevent us just talking about the concept of EL and what we've got. There's probably, I'd say 20, 30 articles now, theses and so on about EL. It's not really a very good research base yet. We're still very much the junior partner. It's so much harder to write EL materials and to analyze what's going on with EL. So I think that's part of the reason, but I do think it's worth an effort of at least putting forward a proposal and see whether it comes forward. So Paul, you got a question for me?
Yeah, I mean, do you think that extensive reading is built on a solid foundation of research?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes and no. So in one sense, yes. I mean, as we were talking about the other day privately, we do know some things. We know about, optimal coverage rates. We know about the amount to be read. We know the effect of, say, motivation and so on and so on. But the counter to that would be no, because a lot of that data is gathered from, obviously convenience populations, typically university students studying only English and usually in rich countries. So, the young learner stuff we don't know, the learning of other languages we don't know. I think also we could talk about, if we're talking about, I think what you're talking about here is more formal extensive reading research. If we were to say, the action research side of things, the sort of like research that would affect my class, or let's say my micro community, I'd say no, that sort of classroom level stuff. What would be the best series to use in China or Thailand? What would the best material to use? Is there a best way to sort of teach extensive reading given the sort of local culture of the way that languages are taught? And I think, there are different countries that have sort of different approaches to the way that languages should be taught. And I think, and different teachers, of course. And so sort of trying to fit that into the sort of local mode, so to speak, I think we need to do it more on that. But we also have to look at this and say that, well, is research the only way that we can validate what we should do in extensive reading? And I would say no. I think there are other ways to validate extensive reading. Testimonials of students about how they've felt they've increased, motivational data, very fuzzy data that comes from all aspects of the language learning curriculum. I think, we shouldn't just look at like the formal research as evidence. But I think that we do have some areas we still need a lot of work in. I mean, I don't think we really understand what level is. This is something that Greg Rolt was talking about just a few minutes ago. We really need to understand what level means and how we grade materials to levels. And we need far better understanding, again, as Greg was saying the other day, of what EFL literacy means. So at one sense, yes, some sort of core principles of EL we know, but once we start digging into the details, I think we still need to have a lot more granular level of knowledge rather than the sort of broad strokes knowledge. And you made a comment the other day about research articles and you challenging yourself. Paul, what was that you were saying the other day? You said if you get a new article, you could say, what was it?
Oh, no, there's something that's been occupying me at the moment is, it's a tongue-in-cheek question, but it's saying, do we need more research? Because I've been looking at a lot of research and trying to see what principles lie behind the findings of such research. And I'm arrogant enough to say that if you show me the research questions and the treatment and the measures which are used, I can tell you what the result will be.
And I'd probably agree with you at the sort of broad strokes level, but it's the fine detail that comes down to the application of that in the actual setting will be, I think, we start to get a bit more fuzzy. I do find the same thing with you, Paul. When I do read an article, you look at that, you look at the structure and you think, I can kind of guess what they're going to say. But sometimes what I do find when I read the articles is what the data say and what how shall I say, the summary or the conclusion that follows it often don't match. You'll find that they interpret their data a little bit differently the way that I would look at the data. So I always look at the data first. That's the first place that I look. What is their data? And then go back, okay, who were the students? What were they doing? Okay, fine. Once I've got that, I never look at the conclusions at first. I work out my own interpretation and see whether I agree with them or not. And is that something that you do?
Well, I did it with your article with Takaki. I guess we've always not argued about that, but we've reached an agreement about it.
Yes, yes, yeah.
I always thought that Rob understated his conclusions there.
And I think that has to do with.
I know why, and he explained why, and I accept that. But
Yeah.
He said that extensive reading only leads to small amounts of vocabulary learning.
Of new words, yes. New words. Of new words.
Of new words, yes. But when you look at each of the three measures that he used, each of the three measures show learning.
Yes.
And so then his conclusion was really based on the toughest measure, where only 4 out of 25 words were learned. But when you go to the most sensitive measure, where credit for partial knowledge, I imagine, exists, then something like 16 out of 25 words were learned.
Right. And the other thing too is an awful lot of knowledge was never even assessed. What was their sort of sense of knowledge that they developed, fluency, lexical access speed, none of that was assessed and can't be assessed necessarily in one piece of research. So there was a lot more going on that research didn't find.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm just talking about your difference between the results and the conclusions, So. Yes. But what do you think needs to be done to get extensive reading accepted more widely? I mean, I just had somebody today approaching me by email saying, look, I'm doing a piece of research, can you give me some advice? And I sort of, the approach I take is, well, I'll answer 3 questions. So choose them wisely, and you can ask them whenever you like. But this person wanted to do research comparing deliberate learning with extensive reading.
Right.
And I said, well, I can tell you the result now.
Yeah, I can too.
The result now, and I can also show you that there is a very big problem, because if you're going to get learners to choose what they want to read for extensive reading, I don't see how you're going to compare it with deliberate learning. And so
I think it's a false comparison as well, because it assumes that it's a sort of a zero-sum game, that one will win, so to speak. So if side A wins, we should stop doing B. That's the kind of mental thought behind it, right? Which is crazy. It's like the question should be, what is the balance of intentional vocabulary versus extensive reading? What's the right balance? Is it 20%, 80%, whatever? It's a poorly formed question as far as I can see.
Anyway, I gave him friendly but frank advice on it, and suggested that it might be more useful to look at how do you get people to accept, and why won't people take on extensive reading as part of a language course,
Yeah, well, my feeling is
it needs to be done.
I think it starts with teacher education. That's first. I think in my experience, many of the places I visit, I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and not only that, but also Japan. I find that the way that I think many people approach the learning of languages is what I call the bookstore theory. That is, if you ask anybody to, just random person, to go learn a language, you need to learn Spanish tomorrow, their theory would be what they see in the bookstore. And they go to the bookstore, what do they see? They see grammar books, they see dictionaries, they see exercises, they see tests, they see all this sort of stuff. And there's this notion that language learning has to be learning focused, language focused learning, as you put it, right? And so what you rarely see reading materials. If you do see reading materials, they tend to be native materials. They tend to be like, your famous Stephen King novels, or something like Harry Potter, or L1 materials for kids. And degraded readers, for example, are just not there. And so they're not made explicit. And I think many people have that sort of default view of the way that languages would be learned. And I think in some ways, it's not beaten out of them, so to speak, by teacher training. We still have the dominant view that we need to learn languages by learning bits and pieces, and therefore extensive reading doesn't fit that model, that mindset, if you will. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers, is just making sure that students and teachers understand the reason why we have extensive reading is that glue that holds things together. It helps build grammatical confidence, vocabulary competence, collocation, discourse awareness, confidence, there's lots and lots of other things. We all are familiar with that. But I think it's the teacher mindset, the student mindset, I think is the biggest problem we have.
Yeah, my theory, without any evidence, is that it's the sort of conscientiousness of teachers too, and that extensive reading seems an activity where teachers shouldn't be too involved. And I think teachers shouldn't be too involved in extensive reading. Learners should get on and do it. But teachers feel rather guilty if they're sitting there not really teaching and the learners are working away on extensive reading and so on.
Certainly. And it's an identity issue as well, is they feel that, this isn't me, I should be standing, teaching, doing something. And if I'm not standing, teaching, doing something, just watching kids read, why the hell am I taking my salary? I don't feel right taking my salary. I'm worried, will the principal look in the window and see I'm not teaching, my kids are just reading? Am I going to get sacked? That's the kind of thought process that many people have.
Yeah, the very first course in extensive reading I ran was in Indonesia, and the reading was done outside of class. But fortunately, I think we had very diligent, these were teacher trainees, and I had very diligent students who actually did the reading out of class, and some were exceptional, really quite astonishing. The teachers' colleges in Indonesia at the time I taught were people who were from very rather poor families who couldn't afford to go to university, but they could afford to go to teachers' college. Right. And so you got very bright people who hadn't had great deal of opportunity. And as soon as they got opportunities and directions in which they could learn, they just shot away. And it was quite astonishing. When I went back about 30 years later, the people that we had taught were the teachers in the teachers' college. And that was very, how would you say, very pleasing to see.
Jeff, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Rob. I'd like to redirect the conversation which you were just having on the point of ER. Most of us, I think, when we first encounter Sapolsky's model, even though it's been updated, are struck, sometimes panicked perhaps, by the fact that there's so little about the EFL learning model that seems to be under the direct influence or available to the direct influence of teachers. One aspect perhaps which can be is motivation. And looking at how extensive reading has become less common in first language as well as second language, at least in long form, are we maybe missing a step or jumping over that first initial step where motivating people to read from a very young age is maybe possibly one of the most effective things which we can do to expand the overall effect of extensive reading as something which teachers can do?
I'll take a somewhat of a tangential answer to that. I think as our world is changing, if we're talking about educating, kids nowadays, their world is going to be largely digital. And, maybe that's going to change the way that we think about extensive reading. Now, one of the things about extensive reading is the materials we use and the volume and so on. And some of that's going to be digital, and it's going to be shorter, more fragmented texts. And I think the concept of reading a long novel is probably disappearing in many ways. And it's, we don't have time for that now. So I think that's going to be one issue that's going to affect how we approach extensive reading in the future. But yes, we do need to certainly make sure there's a lot more reading in L1. And I don't think it's valued as much as it was in the past. I think we now value other things in our education system, whether it be critical thinking skills or whether it be something else. Reading definitely is getting pushed down and down. And I think part of the reaction to that is there've been a few countries in the past which have tried that, Singapore, Hong Kong, they tried it. There was quite a bit of pushback against required reading in schools. And maybe there's a bit of an exhaustion from that, I don't know. The other thing too is I don't think many teachers themselves read and are not born readers. And I think that's potentially a problem, but it also reflects the way that the world is. Maybe reading is becoming less important. Maybe other forms of gathering data and meeting language are becoming more important. And maybe we might find 20 years from now that extensive reading really isn't that important in the big picture of the way that we see the world.
So we're all basically arguing about angels dancing on the head of a pin?
Well, but I just don't know. I mean, as the world moves forward, things are going to be very different. I mean, the notion of reading certainly took off when reading was the only access you got to knowledge. You pick up a book. Now things have changed. Your access to knowledge is so wide. It's at your fingertips every single minute of the day. The need to read a long novel to learn and educate yourself is no longer there as much as it was in the past. So there may be a change in the past, in the future. Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I've got no idea.
All right, well, I'll ask you the next program. Yeah. So,
I mean, the thing is, of course, but behind what you're saying, I mean, you were careful to say reading a long novel, because I think reading, there's lots of different kinds of reading.
Yes. We're always reading something, whether it's digital or whatever. If we talk about reading as a processing,
I believe the data is quite clear that people are actually reading and writing a great deal more than they were 25 or 30 years ago. It's the format that has changed quite a bit. Right.
This is a point that I often make in my talks. People say, oh, people in Thailand don't read. They're on their smartphones all the time. If you talk about reading in terms of processing language, yes.
Well, the interesting thing from that would be that when you read a long novel, because you're reading a text written by one person on one topic, then the richness of vocabulary that you meet is much less than if you cover a wide variety of topics. So you could argue that in terms of meeting a wide variety of words, then doing lots of little bits of reading provides a much more richer environment. The problem is, if that richer environment is overwhelming you with words that are way beyond your current level and you don't need, and so on. But it's not necessarily bad to see that doing lots of bits of short reading can be a really good thing,
Yeah, and that affects EFL publishing, of course, because nearly all graded readers are relatively long. They're like minimum 15 minutes, often 2 to 3 hours. You might need to invest into that. And I think the sort of short stab, like a 2-minute hit, 3-minute hit, 4-minute hit of reading may be more of the model we're going to go to in the future. I think attentions are certainly getting shorter. That's for sure.
In the late 19th century and early 20th century, I know that one of the ways that the masses, with the quotation marks, were educated or brought to be literate was serialization of novels and stories that were extremely popular and lurid even. But it did really increase the number of people who were reading and the number of people who read habitually a great deal.
Right.
Is there an approach similar to that we can use?
Yeah, well, that was the motivation behind the Foundation's reading library that I wrote, was because it's a series of stories set in the same place with the same characters, and the idea to increase their knowledge, and they meet the characters more, and it encourages them to read the next story. A lot of ER materials are sort of standalone. And I think certainly, the Sweet Valley Kids that Krashen always talks about, that kind of thing is definitely something we need to look at. One of the questions Paul asked me, was about what other materials do we need? And I would say those kinds of serialized stuff that engage you, not in just one book, but several books. I think we did a lot more of that kind of thing that we're not currently doing, and also more materials that are more specific to certain areas. We have quite a lot of sort of what you might call generic reading material right now, but we don't have the specialist stuff for science and technology, business, technology in the future. I mean, the world is short of about 1 million programmers right now, IT specialists. So technology is going to be a huge thing in the future, and that would be a growth area for ELT. So some series written around technology would be really useful, I feel.
Atsuko, do you have anything to say about motivation for extensive reading? Because you've looked at it quite a lot.
Myself?
Atsuko.
Yeah, Atsuko.
Yeah, Atsuko.
Yeah. Well, for my students, the motivation improved for especially the repeaters who had difficulty in junior high and senior high at university. And they came to university and they failed the English courses, and they came to my repeater classes. And then they started reading easy books. I gave them very easy books. And they say then, well, this book, then we can read it easily. And they started reading in 3 months. In 2.5 months, they had to read 100 easy books. And then one of the students, after that course, one of the students came to me, and I want to continue another class, another extensive reading class. When I told him that I cannot give you another extra, point, but he said, if I'm alone, I cannot continue reading. So I want to be in the class and I don't need any credit. And he continued reading. And then that class, I taught about seven years of the repeater classes, and many people, many students became, they used to hate English and they had an allergic to English, but gradually they like to study English. They like to read English books because it was the good level for them to read, to enjoy reading. So to enjoy reading is the most important thing, I think. And then they can get the self-confidence, and I can read books, and I can read 100 books. I have read 100 books, and it's a very great motivation for them to keep reading. That's not the university students, but from junior high or the elementary school. Yes, they have to enjoy. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, it's quite interesting for me because I'm actually just started rereading the novel June, D-U-N-E, that I read as a university student, I think, and I'm rereading it because the movie's a good movie of it has come out, and I'm going to take one of my university friends who's in a rest home along to see it. And I thought, I think I'd rather read the novel read the novel again before seeing the movie than to see the movie and then read the novel. I think. I don't know if I've done the right thing or not, but it strikes me that that's one of the motivations for reading, and maybe for sales of books too. And that's the fact that novels and that do relate to other things in the world, like films and all that sort of thing. I got a bonus too from rereading June, because there's a good quote at the beginning of the paragraph. Each chapter begins with a quote from a princess who's writing some sort of history, and the quote is about how the hero of the story did well, not so much because he was clever or anything like that, but because someone had taught him how to learn, and he had confidence in his own ability to learning. So I copied that quote carefully down from a novel, and I hope you'll see it appear in something soon. But it seemed to me that's yet another motivation for reading. If learners, I mean, I'm on this thing at the moment where I think, learning to learn is really important. I think any teacher, no matter what they teach, should be teaching learners how to learn the content of what the learners are covering in that class. And so not just teach the content, but learn how to learn the content. Because it seems to me the principles are very, very well proven, very powerful indeed. I mean, the principles of retrieval, of repetition, of spaced learning, of thoughtful processing, relating unfamiliar knowledge to familiar knowledge. And the principles are very clear, and the research supporting them is enormous. We think there's a lot of research on extensive reading, but there's even more research on the principles of learning. And yet teachers and learners are often not aware of these principles, and often not fully aware of how to apply them. And I reckon there's only about 7 or 8 principles that are really, that learners really need to know, and they could learn those quite quickly. And as part of extensive reading, I see that being very important. Maybe there's something you should include, Paul Goldberg, in your, how does extensive reading help learning, and what are the principles which help learning, and how can you apply and master these principles? I don't think it would be a big deal to have some sort of little unit or app on that or something. I think it's so important.
We're actually working on a graded reader about extensive reading.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think that's what you're suggesting, right?
Yes, I'm even going wider than that. I'm saying that if you're learning a language, or if you're learning anything at all, you should know how to learn, what's important for learning.
I think some
as
of the
I said,
principles you mentioned, Paul, are quite sort of universal, if you will, and it doesn't matter whether you're teaching math or science or whatever, right? I think people know them individually, possibly at the back of their mind. It's kind of common sense, many of these things, but having them sort of together in a formal framework that really sort of gels in terms of language teaching, I think that's the thing that's missing. I think they can't, yes, they need to do repetition, and yes, they need to have retrieval. It's like, how do I do that? And I don't think they have that. It goes back to teacher training. You know, what are those core principles? How do we apply them in the language class or science class or history class or whatever? And more interdisciplinary stuff. So we don't do enough interdisciplinary stuff. So
yeah,
but
I mean, I think that this should be in course books as well. And I sat down and I wrote about 40 or 50 inserts, each about 3 or 4 lines that could be inserted in course books. And so, you know, one insert would say it's really important to get repetition of the things, spaced repetition of the things you need to learn. And you can do this by doing A, B, C, D, you know. And then a couple of lessons later, it'll remind you of that principle. There'll be a little insert which reminds you of that principle and tells you to go back to lesson, you know, 3 units back or something and have a look at that again and how you could improve that, but giving you sort of meta knowledge, but building this into course books. And it would seem to me that in an extensive reading program like Paul Goldberg's developed, you know, that learning these principles of learning just seems to me to be life changes for some people. You probably heard me tell the story of my physiotherapist, you know, who anybody not heard it? Because I'd love to tell it
which
again.
one, Paul? Which one? Go on.
I keep telling the same stories over and over again. But I went to a physiotherapist, and to cut a long story short, I found out he worked with my nephew. And when he was made redundant, and when he worked with my nephew in telecom, and in telecom, one of the teachers on courses that they had gave them advice about how to learn the material. And the advice that the person gave wasn't that great. It was all about putting it on post-it notes and sticking it in the not in the toilet, but in the bathroom and on the refrigerator and all of that sort of stuff, you know, it was sort of low-level principled advice, but it was good. And then the guy said, when I was at secondary school, I thought I was dumb because every subject I studied and worked, I didn't do well. And then when this guy showed me things to do to help learning, he said, I realized I wasn't dumb at all. And so when he got made redundant from telecom, he decided to go and do a university course on physiotherapy and is now one of New Zealand's top physiotherapists. So that teacher changed his life by showing how to learn and by giving him confidence in his own ability to learn. So the writer, Frank Herbert, who wrote June, is correct, you know how to learn and be confident in your ability to learn. And I think somehow in extensive reading, we've got to get that in there too.
But I think you've also, you know, you spent your career trying to help people understand things, and your books, like, you know, what should every EFL teacher know, for example, ta-da, is very powerful, and it makes the case for a certain amount of, you know, the 4 strands and so on. And I just want to look at the extensive reading sort of strand, so to speak, you know. We're talking kind of mathematical terms about, you know, 3/16 of a course, this, that, and the other. Could you just sort of elaborate how that might work across, you know, what we've just been discussing, you know, in terms of teacher training and awareness and so on? Yeah,
I mean, the idea of the 4 strands is something that it seems to me a very simple idea. But it's one that it took me several years to get to, because I read all of this research, and it was very interesting research in applied linguistics, but I couldn't see how it fitted together for teachers and things like that. You know, I said, all of this stuff should relate to each other and should, you know, come together to make a course. And so over a period of time, I arrived at the idea that, you know, 1/4 of the time on learning from input, 1/4 of the time on learning from output, 1/4 of the time deliberate study, and 1/4 of the time on fluency development. And it's pretty hard to prove that it should be 1/4.
Well, certainly when you talk about different levels of students, right, who have different needs, yeah.
Yeah, you and I think we disagree on that. I think that
We do.
Yeah,
we have a long conversation on that.
I think that you should stick fairly rigidly to the 1/4 idea, and it doesn't matter what level of proficiency you're at.
Okay.
And that's because I think that even at the lowest level of proficiency, you should develop fluency. And at the highest level of proficiency, it's useful to do some deliberate study and things like that. So I think that's important. But then if you set that in stone, you can then make very useful statements, I think, for teachers and curriculum designers about, say, how much time should you spend on extensive reading?
Mm.
Well, extensive reading is meaning-focused input.
Mm-hmm.
And reading is half of meaning-focused input and listening is the other half.
Mm-hmm.
So then at least 1/8 of the time in a language course should be extensive reading.
Mm-hmm.
Extensive reading also involves fluency. You should be fluent in your reading.
Mm-hmm.
And 1/4 of the fluency strand should be reading. And so 1/4 of a course is 1/16. And so this is where we get 3/16 of the time in a language course in and out of class should be spent on extensive reading. Now, I always smile to myself and say, wow, 3/16, boy, I've got it nailed there, you know.
Yeah, it does sound a little bit too mathematical.
It's like saying, you know, 7/48 or something like that, you know. And so you've got to be a bit relaxed about it. But that seems to me then that you then have a rational way of deciding.
You have a framework which can be modified from, yes.
Yeah, and it's a rational way. And you say, well, why not spend more? And the answer then would be, well, what are you going to take time away from? Are you going to take time away from listening fluency or speaking fluency? Or are you going to take time away from, you know, learning from extensive listening? So that if you do decide to alter how much extensive reading you do, you then have a rational way of saying, well, what am I going to sacrifice in order for that to take up that proportion? So I think I'm quite happy with that. I quite like that. And I quite like to being able to sort of measure things and put them in boxes and so on like that. But it seems to me then that whatever you do, you've got a rational argument for it. And if someone wants to attack that rational argument, great, because they know where you're coming from and so on. And if you have to defend it, then that's good too, because then you might have to change your ideas, and that's always good. But anyway, let's not do too much more.
Yeah. So there was a sort of a general focus here on extensive reading, research, and so on. So maybe we should move a little bit back more towards that.
Yeah.
So what
yeah, go on. What would you see as being the most common design errors in extensive reading research, Rob? Because you've done a lot of work on that.
Yeah, I would say confounding variables is one. I mean, there's quite a lot of sort of, you know, quite well-known research out there, which I know the people who've done it and I know their circumstances, and they're talking about the places that they've done it at their schools, for example. And I know there are 6 other English classes. And I know that some of these kids have been studying hard for TOEIC outside. So confounding variables, which are not reported, I think, is one of the bigger problems. And I think unequal time that people have, ER versus whatever the other thing would be, I think this very difficult, and people don't validate that it was done yesterday. Just yesterday, I was reading a paper that somebody, you know, said group A did this, group B did this, but there was no validation that that was actually done. And I think the unequal quality of the materials that people would have in treatment A, treatment B. And before I mentioned about comparison research, where we're trying to compare 2 things which shouldn't be compared, you know, intentional vocabulary against extensive reading, they're completely different things. So why are we comparing them? It's what's the relationship between the two? So I think just the way we form some of the questions is, to me, a bit troublesome. And on top of all of that, something that you know well about is the relatively poor quality of some of the tests out there. People are home-making tests. They don't really understand some of the principles of how to make tests well, or they would take a generic test, you know, your old levels test from the 1990, whenever it was. It's still being used as a validation instrument when it wasn't even intended to be. It's supposed to be a levels test. It wasn't supposed to be an overall benchmark of somebody. So I think just those kind of things, confounding variables, I think is really key. Making sure that you've got a research question that actually makes sense, I think is really quite important. That's not to say that the research is not providing anything valuable. It's a bit less valuable than maybe it should be. How about you, Paul?
Well, when you and I worked on the extensive reading book, what surprised me was that I came away from it feeling that the research basis for extensive reading was shaky. And the shakiness didn't come from a lack of research or even from a lack of positive findings, but it came from the sort of shakiness of the design of some of the pieces of research. Now, we've got to be sympathetic towards that, because it's really hard to do research on extensive reading.
Very messy.
If you want to do, what I would call real extensive reading, then controlling variables is terribly difficult.
Right.
And extensive reading is something which should go on for a long time, and so a lot of the research should be longitudinal.
Right.
There are so many other variables to control, and so that was part of the motivation for the chapter in the book which talks about the most, how would you say, what I wanted to do in the book. There was a chapter on, it wasn't called the best pieces of research, but saying what pieces of research would you refer somebody to if you wanted to convince them that they should do extensive reading, and you were going to use research to support your argument. So then we tried to arrive at about, I can't remember now, probably 6, 7, 8 studies, which each had its own little faults, which are unavoidable, but which would be the ones which you would say, these are the really strong pieces of research.
Right.
And it wasn't too hard to find those. But there were lots and lots of pieces of research which you said, well, yeah, the finding's probably true, but boy, I'd hate to have to defend this piece of research. So
as
that
a
was
piece of research
thing for me.
Right. But if you had a body of research, let's say 10, 20, 30 articles doing roughly the same kind of things, and they roughly come to the same conclusion, I think we can look at sort of a generic answer to that. And a point that you were just making, I wanted to respond to. I think it was probably 10, 12 years ago, I think it was the National Reading Panel in the US was trying to validate the case for extensive reading. This is something that Krashen was talking about quite a bit. And their criteria for whether extensive reading was a valid thing to do in schools or not was based on this model that is very, very difficult to achieve in extensive reading, is highly controlled, equal time on task, all those, like perfect piece of research. And they found like only 1 or 2. This is for L1, not for L2. And therefore, all of that great research which is out there, which is sort of, how should I say, indicative of a direction to go, that didn't actually meet those very strict requirements, was thrown out. And therefore, the outcome of the panel was skewed, because it was ignoring all that very messy but very useful stuff. And I think we have to be quite careful about this. And I think one of the resistances we get from school boards and from ministries of education is that it doesn't meet the same sort of academic level of research that we would expect from somewhere else. Therefore, we can't bring it into the program and or to the curriculum. I think there's definitely an issue there, but it's very, very messy. Even if you had $1 million, it probably still wouldn't solve the problem, because you might do that with, in a very controlled situation in, say, Thailand. But does that necessarily apply in Spain? Does it apply in, Malawi, for example? So I think we've got really a big issue there. But again, we need to be relaxed about it, as we should be relaxed about the 4 strands. I think we need to be relaxed and just take it generally where we try to be, and what we're trying to actually achieve. We can't be specific too much. I think it's just an impossible ask. We're not physics, we're not biology. Right.
Now, Mark's commented, is the ER research any worse than the EFL research in general? It's certainly not better in general, but I mean, yeah,
Quite a lot of research comes from out of, let's say, a master's paper or a PhD. Quite a lot of research comes on that basis, the ones that we see. And to be honest, this is often the first or maybe second piece of research that somebody's done, and it gets quite a bit of traction. And, it's the research that's been done by what you might call seasoned researchers that I would prefer to look at. I mean, they may be very interesting, not saying it's not valuable, and it might not be as well controlled, and maybe the supervisor is not an expert in the area. And I think we have to just, put a little flag up there to sort of say, well, who is this person? What's their background? What are they doing? Are they reporting accurately or not? There's a few little question marks sometimes that it would naturally be of anybody who's relatively new to the area. That's not meant to disparage anybody in particular, but those people who are more seasoned, I think, are the ones I would probably look at their research more than just the random, unknown, in a very unkind sense, not meant to be unkind sense, sort of people who are relatively new to the field. I think we should maybe slightly less look at that. I mean, because often these people are trying to come up with a revolution in language learning when it's not really a revolution.
I'm very happy to see that there are now quite a lot of meta-analyses of various aspects of EFL research. I can see there are problems with meta-analysis, but it struck me when I was trying to look for these principles, looking at a whole range of pieces of research in EFL and saying, what principle does this research, do the findings of this research exemplify, and it seemed to me that one of the strengths of a meta-analysis is that it gets rid of the local factors and looks at what the generalizable factors across a whole pile of very different pieces of research, seem to find. And so it seems to me to have that strength of sort of being able to get rid of the little bits which might be important perhaps, but to highlight the really important aspect of that research. And so there are now quite a lot of meta-analyses in vocabulary studies, and I think they're a good thing. I mean, there are dangers with them, and as there is with any research, but I think that they show then that, as you were saying, that there's all these funny bits of research which you'd sort of, you're not too sure about, but they seem to all point to the same sort of thing. I wonder if anybody else would like to chip in with some questions or comments.
Yep. That was exactly what I was going to say.
We've known each other for too long.
Not long enough, Paul.
Oh, I can ask Rob another difficult question if there is.
Okay, go ahead then. Sarah's got a hand up.
Yeah.
Sarah, I'm not sure.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. I'm also not an extensive reading expert. I originally was interested in authentic materials and authenticity in language learning. And then I had to teach a reading course, and it sort of somehow led me to extensive reading. And I've sort of recently just been looking at using authentic materials in extensive reading. And I was wondering if you had any comments about that, because you were talking a little bit about the sort of short reading that a lot of people tend to do now. A lot of it is online. And in my study, I found that very much so, possibly sort of exacerbated by the effects of the pandemic. And I was sort of thinking, oh, they're going to be at sea in this whole online world. And usually the students seem to be very good at navigating it without my input.
To me, I would have to ask you a question, who are your students?
Oh, they were university students in Japan.
Okay, but that, I'm talking about their level. I mean, many university students in Japan are still beginners, right? And some of them are highly advanced. So, if you're talking about authentic material, if you're trying to give them, let's say, Stephen King novel to a beginner, clearly that's not appropriate, right? So it's that relationship between what you might call native level ungraded material and where the students' level are and what their motivation is. I think there's a lot of factors goes on there. And Paul, you're mid-frequency readers and all of that is your
No, I was very influenced by an article by Henry Widdowson on authenticity. Have you read that article or not?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's the one from On TESOL, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, because he made what I thought was just an excellent point. And he said, you can view authenticity as something which resides in material, or you can view authenticity as a relationship between the learner and that material. And so the idea is, for example, if someone picks up an authentic novel, so the authenticity lies in the material, but they don't have a big enough vocabulary or reading skill to read it, then they don't get an authentic experience. Whereas if someone picks up a graded reader and reads it, it's not authentic material in the sense that you might define it, but they're likely to get an authentic reading experience. And he makes a point that we must make sure that learners get authentic reading experiences. And so that's why sometimes when I hear authentic material, my heart sinks, because I think, hello,
Mine did too, just then. Yeah.
we're now going to get material where you need around about 8,000 or 9,000 word vocabulary in order to get an authentic reading experience. And
Right.
it is fine for learners to read authentic material, but it fits into what I would call the language-focused learning strand, which includes intensive reading. And whereas extensive reading, for me, should be the authenticity of the experience, not the authenticity of the material.
Yes, you're lost in the story, and I think that's the key thing. I think the answer should be, if you want to have an authentic experience, it should be that the level that's just slightly above where they are or within their level, that they can just get lost in the reading. And I think you don't have to ask them comprehension questions. That to me would be an authentic experience. But I don't think that's necessarily what you were asking. Is that right? You were asking about non-graded materials, right?
That's right. So I'm sorry if I could just get a slight bit more of background. I actually did investigate authenticity as you're talking about it, sort of individual perceptions of authenticity previously. And that's what I was very interested in, sort of, do students perceive graded readers to be authentic? And I haven't seen anybody sort of looking at that research, but my previous question was actually about non-graded material has sort of traditionally been viewed as not able to give students this authentic experience. But when I sort of allowed my students the freedom to choose what they wanted to read, several of them went on the sort of online news article route. And I was very concerned about that because I thought it would be far beyond their linguistic level. And in that case, very inauthentic and demotivating. But it seems to have not been the case in my particular course.
Okay, so then my question would be, what did they learn from that? They may have had an authentic experience, but our job as language teachers is to teach language, help them learn language, however you frame it.
Right.
So, if they've had an authentic experience, but they didn't pick up much vocabulary, or they didn't pick up much fluency, they didn't pick up much more language awareness, then was that a valuable language learning experience? And that, I think, has to be asked as well. In fact, they may have had an authentic experience, might be great from a motivational point of view, but we also have linguistic goals. And a lot of the non-graded material, as you know, is standalone. Every book is independent of each other. There's no necessarily scaffolding of learning. They're not programmed in a certain way. They're not written so that words are repeated and grammar's repeated. And so they're not really meeting we have to be very careful here, the EFL conditions, where we do not have language outside that needs that control. So the native material will be maybe fine in ESL. If you were learning English in Canada or Australia, New Zealand, you're going to get, many, many hours of English outside, and that will be fine. And therefore, ESL, maybe non-graded material will be fine. But in EFL, I would say, if this is the only English they're getting every week, how are we building their vocabulary, their sense of language there, so on and so on? And that would have to be shown to me that the material can do. And if you look at the research by, it was John McAllister and Stuart Webb, I think, looked at whether children's non-graded authentic material would be suitable for language learners, and they found an emphatic no.
Justin and Patrick are making some useful comments in the chat, simply saying that how would you support this authentic material so that you're more likely to get an authentic reading experience. And it seems to me that your learners reading news, for example, if they follow the same news story,
narrow, yeah,
and so you're sort of narrowing the reading to some degree. We've done research on that, and the research shows it doesn't make enormous differences, but it is certainly supportive in terms of vocab. It doesn't increase the repetition of content words enormously. You might have a dozen or so words if you're lucky, which are repeated more than 6 times or something like that. But on the other hand, the learners bring a lot of background knowledge from the previous readings and that sort of thing, which make it much easier, which is the point I think Justin and Pat were making about, watching a movie and then reading a book or something like that. And I think that's great. I mean,
just one of your students,
one way, but there are other supports as well.
One of your ex-students, who I can't name, has just sent me a picture, sent me an article, maybe she sent it to you as well, about narrow listening.
You've cut them by 50% already, Rob.
And so you know who she is, and I can't mention it because it's pre-publication, but she found for narrow extensive listening had dramatic effects over relatively random listening. So it found and an effect on this. So it had an effect not only within the reading that they did, but also on future. Beg your pardon, listening, not reading. Yeah. So a lady in Vietnam. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about.
Should extensive reading be a required subject in the language course? I
think in the absence of motivation, yes. If the students are not motivated, I would say yes, because as what I was saying just 2 to 3 minutes ago, that our goal is language teachers. Now, if we are a literature teacher, we're teaching literature, that's a very different type of goal. But as language teachers, I think that we need to make sure the students can learn the language. And if we just allow them to do only language-focused learning, or all they ever do is speaking, I think we're sort of not really training them the way they probably should be. And there's a strong case to be made that extensive reading is the kind of glue that holds things together. It provides the extra input, the collocations, and so on, as I mentioned before. So I would say, in the absence of student motivation, require it as gently as possible, but just make sure that it's done. Make sure some of it's done, because that's our job. Otherwise, we're not really doing our job properly. I think that's the way I would answer that.
Yeah, Kimberly's made a note in the chat saying that children's or authentic materials are, I wouldn't say that they're emphatically unsuitable. You've got to select carefully. And I think you can do that. I think there's several articles looking at using text analysis programs to show that some bits of reading will be less burdensome than others from a vocabulary perspective. The problem with all, meaningful vocab learning is Zipf's law.
Yes.
And Zipf's law simply says that in any connected, sensible written material, there'll be a certain distribution frequency of the vocabulary in that material. And that is, half of the words will only occur once, a very small number will occur a very large number of times, a very large number will occur only a small number of times. And even in graded readers, and even in course books, Zipf's law still works, and you get that curve. So anyone who's serious about the teaching and learning of vocabulary should come to a little understanding of Zipf's law. Joseph Sorel has written a very good entry for it in one of the encyclopedias of applied linguistics or something like that. I can give you the reference, but it's you're sort of battling against that all the time. And the real positive thing of graded readers is that even though Zipf's law applies to graded readers, with only half of the words in any of the different words in any book occurring only once, even those words that occur only once are worth learning, because the way that graded readers are made all of the vocabulary is useful, or
Yeah.
almost all of it.
Yeah.
And so the Zipf's, you can't defeat the Zipf's law from a repetition perspective within one piece of reading, but you can make sure that it doesn't bring in lots of useless stuff and so on. And that's why graded readers are so important.
Yeah, and just to sort of finish off, and I know we've got like a minute left before the AGM, but you know, to reiterate what you were saying, I did a comparison of the native novel Frankenstein versus 2 or 3 different versions of graded reader. It was very, very clear the number of words at the 8,000, 9,000, 12,000 level was just off the scale, and they would not be learned. Obviously, the access to that, what we might call authentic material, was really quite difficult for them. So, you know, I think it's a huge thing that we need to make sure that we have that material that's right for those learners, and it's critical whether they are. Oh, Paul's gone.
No, I was just checking the time.
yeah. So I think it's critical that we have the right kinds of materials for the students. So, Mark, I think we have to hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Rob and Paul. I'm just going to stop the recording for a moment.